So this is from Rhiannon from University of Sheffield, who wonderfully was able to be with us last time, is with us today as well. So she's asking, how do you suggest she approaches offences that don't appear in the guidelines? And also, how do you weigh attempted offences?
Right. Well, Matt and May Britt, I think, can give some good answers to that. Matt, you want to start us off on the English perspective on attempted versus completed? What's the underlying logic here?
So it's back to perfect being the enemy of the good, really. Not every offence in the Home Office classifications has an obvious minimum sentencing guideline. Most of them do. But there are obscure ones that don't. And Eleanor, like me, will have severe headaches at times when we try to go and find something. And you have to dig around for quite a long time to do it. Sometimes it can be a case of finding the best nearest match of an offence. We then put that through a controlled process. So we have a panel which we will submit proposals to, who will agree something, and then we will update the final spreadsheet so it's embedded in the downloadable version of the harm index. On attempted offences, they do appear in the Home Office classifications, and they do have sentencing guidelines. Invariably, they are weighted the same as the actual offence. So if you search for the word attempted on the spreadsheet, you'll find that there are instances in there of attempted offences. But an attempt kidnap is weighted the same as a kidnap, for example.
Right. Actually, Paul House wants to add to that. Paul, go ahead.
Just to say that here in WA, our Sentencing Act actually allows a provision for attempted offences whereby the maximum sentence is cut in half. So when applying values to a crime harm index, what I did here is just took the crime harm index value for the actual sentence, or the median sentence that I calculated, and then divided that by 2 for an attempted offence.
And that's how the offence was reported, as an attempted offence. It was convicted as an attempted offence, and therefore you use the reduced sentencing practice.
That's right.
Right. Okay. Well, that's really interesting, especially in light of what I think may bother a lot more people when we start rank ordering offenders based on the charges that have been filed against them, without requiring that there be convictions, or rank ordering victims with the reported offenses against them without requiring that somebody was even arrested for that offense. We're now looking at considering crime in a different context than the courtroom, and a different context from I think, a legal framework for estimating harm, as distinct from what underlies this whole approach, and that is social science. That is, crime statistics are an exercise in measurement. Measurement is an attempt to take an underlying phenomenon and characterize it in readily objective terms that everybody can see. The easiest way to do that is with a number. So if we start with most police reported crimes, that is, crimes reported to the police, not getting solved at all, we'd either have to throw them all out, as Brazil does, which when I went there 15 years ago, they said they only count as a murder an offense for which there was a conviction. Well, that's surely a good way to keep your homicide rate down, to look good in UN statistics comparing across countries. But then this is not really an approach that is much used across countries for precisely those reasons. Our basic hope is that it can be used within countries, but in places like the US, it may well be that it's only good to be used within states, or possibly even within counties or within cities, because practices of counting, differences in reporting can vary so much. So again, we don't necessarily want to have a tool that is limited by each local jurisdiction. I think what we're really talking about here is a conceptual approach that can be refined anywhere for any particular purpose. And so we're encouraging you to think not like lawyers, but like social scientists who are trying to estimate in the eyes of the public, the sustainability and legitimacy of the police depending on public trust and confidence. What is it that we are trying to accomplish that is reflected in what the judges have decided is the relative severity of punishment that's appropriate, again, with a view to the public and their eyes on public opinion polls as they try to judge that in a very systematic way, as opposed to, shall we say, 5 people in an ops room sitting around and deciding a set of priorities based on their own personal perspectives, which is a far cry from having a bunch of numbers from an imperfect yet systematic in its imperfections, the systematic approach of a crime harm index. And I think it's time for Peter to clarify what I've just said.
Well, I was going to pick up the point about the comparisons across countries. I know we've got a couple of other questions that touch on various aspects of this, but there's been a sort of assumption about harm indices and comparators between different countries, that when you applied a technique like this to a range of different countries, you'd end up with widely different scores. And our experience thus far is that that isn't the case. There is actually quite a considerable amount of consistency across countries. Although rather ironically, you mentioned the United States of America, it turned out that there was more difference between 2 states in the US than there was between half a dozen countries that we compared when we'd constructed the indices. So there is something slightly odd going on in the United States, but I expect René could comment on that one. But there was a very considerable consistency, even across jurisdictions that were not, as it were, the Anglo-Saxon common law jurisdiction. So it's a slightly more consistent, and of course, the more that we do this, the more that we replicate it, and the more that we can look at comparisons across similar ranges of offences, the more that we'll be able to test that particular theory.
Okay, well, René, maybe we should get you to comment from a US perspective, and Natalie from a Canadian perspective, on how far you think you ought to go beyond one jurisdiction in terms of, things like allocating state money for dealing with violent crime the way it's been allocated in England and Wales in the past several years. How shall we say, useful and reliable is one of the US sentencing approaches to crime harm index? Or do you think it really does depend on having the kind of sentencing guidelines that England and Wales can offer?
Actually, I sent Peter a message because I'm like, what 2 states? But I could see, I mean, even not even knowing the 2 states, I could see how there would be big differences between states. I did my work in California, but I know, like right now, a perfect example is possession of marijuana has been legalized in many states and has been a misdemeanor even before it was legalized in California for a long time, where it was still a felony in other states. So you had this huge disparity of how much time people were serving in jails for the same crime in different states across the country. So when I think about like how to make that more even and then how to allocate like resource dollars, I think there is something to be said to figure out like how to make it more even across the country. Because yeah, if you think about, especially where our state lines cross, that if you're, 10 miles within some state line, you could be convicted in one state, 5 more years, versus if you were 10 miles to the south, you would have, the amount of time you spent in jail would be 10 years left or 10 years in prison. So I think the United States right now we're so varied across our states that we would need an individual crime harm index across each state, and then maybe averaging all 50 to somehow come up with like one sentencing structure to use, maybe.
Well, there's where I think we go beyond the purpose of a crime harm index. We're not here to be all things to all people. And right. I'm very happy to have a police force use whatever index it chooses to try to run the police force in a much more rational way. Doesn't matter what the police force next door is doing. We leave it at that. There is a picture of a family in England that has a property in which their garden is in one COVID tier, with different rules and restraints on the occupants of the property in that area, and their house is in a different tier. And so I guess as long as they don't go out into their garden, they'll stay under one set of rules. But somewhere these boundaries get us in trouble. Natalie comes from Canada, where it's well known that the state or province of Quebec has far higher crime severity scores than the other provinces, or at least they used to. And so I wonder whether if there is any national money being doled out, there's any issue about whether that's actually reflecting difference in harm or difference in reporting, and whether Canada can get on just as well by having Ontario use the crime severity scores and not pay any attention to what's going on in Alberta or out in Vancouver. So Natalie, what do you think about this from a Canadian perspective?
Well, from a Canadian perspective, I know that Quebec is still up there, but there's other cities that are certainly emerging, like Edmonton and Winnipeg out west, as scoring very high in crime severity. I think that we're lucky. We do have the Criminal Code of Canada and the Canadian Crime Severity Index that's built on that, which makes it great for a uniform application, no matter what province that you're living in. I think that there is some, we're kind of in infancy in terms of Canada in operationalizing the crime severity index in policing. I'm hoping that we're able to adopt it and apply it in policing within Ontario fairly shortly, as being one of the bigger provinces. I think that in terms of the crime harm index, obviously my specialty is looking at victim and offender relationships, so offending as well as victimization. I think in terms of what we do need to share and what there needs to be more of, and I know that in the States they do run into some issues with sharing police data. I think that if you're having crimes that are occurring, again, province to province, but even if you look locally within the provinces, if you have crimes occurring, say, within my jurisdiction by certain types of criminals or people being victimized, we're so close together that the borders are really borderless. You can have offenders that are committing crimes within my jurisdiction and two neighboring jurisdictions. However, we're not sharing the data appropriately to really look at what that looks like, what the picture really looks like on a local level. So I would say if we're talking about the crime severity index on a local level, definitely sharing police data would be a good plan to give us a more holistic picture on what we should do with that information.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Now, May Britt has something I think you could say about a different issue, which is not across jurisdictions at the same point in time, but actually there's a bit of this argument going on in Sweden right now about whether crime has actually gotten a lot more harmful in Sweden, according to a harm index, because it is more harmful, or because there's been changes in the way that there might be reporting or even classification of these offenses. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Lou to bring in the question we had from the University of Montreal, which is on a related issue. But May Britt, tell us what you know about this debate and whether you think the Swedish Crime Harm Index, even in version 3 that you're about to roll out, would be reliable, say, for the last 20 years, or would you want to be as qualified as I think we have to be about England and Wales because they changed the counting rules so much over that time period?
Well, what have happened last year is that there has been a change in the approach from the politicians and also the public about the sentences that are supposed to be given. And we have now a big debate within both groups that we would like to increase the penalties, particularly prison time. And of course, that would change the Swedish Crime Harm Index, particularly the third one that we are now developing, that will be based on the sentences from last year. So what we talk about is to have a kind of repeating update, like each second or each third year, to be sure about that we cover the progress within the country, because that is interesting to see. And even though that it might be seriously more violent or more higher sentences, it will be harder to compare, but we still can see the differences from year to year. And we can also explain it when we do the analysis of the final result.
Sure.
Because we can tell 2020 was this and 2023 we had this kind of penal code and sentencing guide.
So what you can do statistically is to go back even 10 years and use the current sentencing framework to see whether the change in harm is going to disappear if you hold constant the sentencing values from either 2020 or 2010, whatever they might be. And in fact, you can compute both lines. And if you hold constant the measurement, then the lines might stay flat. They might go up. They might even go down.